Good afternoon, I'm Kezia Dugdale and I'm the Director of the John Smith Centre. We exist to make the positive case for politics and public service, and we try and do that in three key ways. Through research, we study the relationship between the public and their politicians. We also run a variety of different internship and development programmes designed to break down the barriers that people face accessing public life. And we also advocate for politics as a force for good in the world, as public service is a force for good in the world, with events like today's, discussing the public service role of journalism and the dangers of fake news. We are delighted to be joined today by Nick Sheridan. Nick is a TV and radio presenter, a lecturer, and now an author, having recently published his first book, Breaking News: How to Tell What's Real from What's Rubbish. Shortly, I'm going to ask Nick to introduce his book, and he'll do that with a few slides. And then I'm going to turn the tables and thoroughly enjoy asking this journalist some probing questions. If you'd like to shape what we discuss, you can submit your own questions through the Q&A box on your screen, and that will come through to our team here at the John Smith Centre. This event is recorded so that we can make it available to people to watch in their own time and share it through our networks here at the University of Glasgow and further afield. So Nick, welcome to the Centre. We are delighted to hear about your work, and I'll give you a second or two there just to pop your slides up and say hello to everybody tuning in.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much, first of all, Kezia, for having me and everyone at the John Smith Centre. It's an absolute pleasure to be here joining you from a very, very rainy Glasgow, it's safe to say. Thanks for having me. It's delighted to be asked to do this because it's something that I suppose what Kezia mentioned there about making the case for positive politics and making a case for it. Of course, a lot of the politics, I guess, that we might interact with generally on a day-to-day basis can be in the negative sphere, I guess. So it's great to actually be chatting about the importance of reporting real good news stories, and also, if the news is overwhelming or is a wee bit confusing, particularly for young people, then that's part of what the book is all about, to try and have those conversations in the first place. So yes, as Kezia mentioned, I'm just going to show you a couple of slides that I have prepared in advance. This is the part now where the whole thing goes pear-shaped, but I'm sharing my screen now, and I can just show you this. So this is so Breaking News: How to Tell What's Real from What's Rubbish is the name of the book, and essentially this came out of a place around, I suppose, 18 months ago when the first of the coronavirus pandemic was really starting to hit home, and it felt like this was a very, very different news story. This was a type of story that certainly I think journalists my age and of my generation would never really have dealt with before, where it felt like all of a sudden the entire country was relying on news that was being reported, that politics and news was no longer just a spectator sport, that suddenly it had a real impact on all our lives. So my immediate thought was, well, if adults are feeling overwhelmed or confused by what they're seeing and what they're reading, then how might kids be feeling about that? And my background is, first and foremost, I started off as a reporter on a children's news programme back in Dublin with RTE. So that was something that I wanted to do, was to make a sort of a horrible histories for news, essentially, to I suppose inspire young people and to tell young people that it's totally okay if you're feeling a wee bit overwhelmed or nervous by the news, but for teachers as well, and for educators in whatever space they might be existing in, just to give them some tools that they could then use to apply to the news. So part of, myself, quick background. So Nick Sheridan is my name. I studied journalism in Dublin, DCU University, and then moved to commercial television first and radio in Dublin, then moved to RTE and worked on News Today, which is the young person's news programme. I then worked in the main newsroom within RTE before moving over to STV in Glasgow, and then moving to the BBC, where I began as a camera journalist, so shooting and editing my own video. And then moved to traditional reporting. I was consumer affairs correspondent for a time, and now I am working as a presenter, both in television and radio with the BBC, and also lecturing at the moment in radio production. So there's some slides generally of myself doing the job. So the book is essentially a book that's sort of broken down, I suppose, into, first of all, fake news: how to tell what is real from what is rubbish, or what is true from what is poo, was one suggested title that ultimately didn't ended up making it. But what we're trying to do, not just, I suppose, fake news like purposefully spread fake news, but also news, pictures, images, tweets. So not just in the traditional news arena, but WhatsApp messages that you get from your auntie, or stuff on Instagram that you see, or stuff. I know not a lot of young people are on Facebook right now, but when I was growing up, a lot of our news was through Facebook, social media, podcasts as well as a new space that is really interesting to watch, particularly I'm thinking of, for example, the Joe Rogan podcast, which got into some hot water a couple of weeks ago around vaccine misinformation and Spotify having to take down some episodes. So fake news and disinformation doesn't just come from what we might think of as a traditional news outlet, but also it can be much more deeply ingrained in the media that we consume every day. So that's what the book is looking at. And essentially, particularly for, I suppose, for teachers and for educators and for parents as well, the whole idea of this is to build and nurture a healthy pattern, I suppose, of evaluating and understanding upsetting news stories. And of course, we have the horrendous images that we're seeing from Ukraine at the moment, which are extremely upsetting for adults even. So for kids, I mean, a lot of the book goes into news that does make you feel maybe a wee bit anxious, a wee bit upset, a wee bit confused or bewildered or whatever. And first of all, it's recognizing that is a totally valid reaction to have. You may have questions. A young person might have questions about the news that they've seen. They may not have questions about news that they have seen, but it's about recognizing those feelings, saying, listen, this book is designed to basically help you out if you are maybe feeling that the news is a wee bit overwhelming for you. So that's also part of not just the fake news, but the real news that we get and how to deal with it when we think it's becoming a wee bit more overwhelming. Essentially what we do, so this is what we think of traditional teaching as teaching reading, writing and arithmetic. Most of my family are teachers, both my parents and my brother, his wife, aunts and uncles, my whole family are teachers. I could never be a teacher, particularly because I think this is more of an idea of what teachers are expected to deliver in classrooms around about now. So not just the traditional reading, writing, arithmetic, but also everything else as well. So a lot of the book is trying to, I suppose, lighten the load for teachers and to be a resource within the classroom to help them tackle some of the issues. Certainly within this list of public speaking is something that we touch on quite a lot. Different perspectives on history as well. So part of our News Herald Hall of Fame is looking at journalists that potentially you may not have heard of, but certainly would have been at the forefront and pioneering the field of journalism, but maybe from backgrounds or maybe during their lifetime or when they were around, they might not have got the recognition that they deserved as well. So as I mentioned, fake news is an enormous part of what the book is all about. And what we're trying to do is trying to break down for young people what exactly we mean when we talk about fake news. And we go into that at great depth. As well as that, we're talking, these are the sorts of the tips that you would find within the book. So it's talking about common sense. It's talking about that wee little voice in your head that makes you think, am I really convinced that this is actually the truth? This is actually the case? And once that little voice has been triggered, then what the book does, it goes into techniques and ways and tools, I suppose, equipping young people with tools to then investigate and evaluate the sources of where that information is coming from, the sources. In particular, I know in our own work now looking at Russia and Ukraine, there's an awful lot of user-generated content. So stuff that's filmed on phones and stuff that's been streamed live, etc. It's very difficult to know often for broadcasters whether or not what they're looking at is actually true. That happened during the conflict in Syria as well, where the pictures were absolutely mind-blowing in terms of what they were purporting to portray. But then if you dig a little bit deeper, then in fact you may find that the person who is posting it may in fact want to elicit a response from you, and they are using this footage to elicit that response. So it's about evaluating what the response is inside you. And what we talk about to the kids is think about the reaction that the person posting is trying to make you feel. If you're trying to look at it through an emoji, for example, you might wonder, well, is this person trying to make me feel nervous? Are they trying to make me dislike a particular sector of society or a particular group within society, whether it be people who come here from other countries or whether it be people who look a certain way or who fall in love with a certain person? And that's what the book is sort of drilling down into as well. Yes, that's what I mentioned there as well. There's a lot of kind of fake or fact stuff within the book as well. So we give what are hopefully sort of humorous examples of sort of instances where we pass it over to the reader, we pass it over to the child, and we ask them to figure out whether or not they think a story is fake or fact. So this was one particular an example of a bear hunt which was underway when there was this rainbow bear, which is sort of a mascot in Ardrossan, and basically a person stole the bear and then posted a ransom note saying that they wanted sausage roll, 2 Greggs sausage rolls, and the kids were asked to figure out whether that was real or whether it wasn't. I can confirm that that is actually a true story, which a lot of people are often surprised by, and then we go into then clues that might help the child decide whether their story is real or fake. As well as another example would be this individual in Canada. There was a curfew in place in this place called Sherbrooke, but people walking their dogs were exempt from the rules. So a woman attached a lead to her husband and subsequently walked him around the block. And then when the police basically confronted her, she insisted she was not her husband, but a dog that was walking on 2 legs. As a matter of fact, that is also true, which was so that's another example basically of some of the exercises that we use within the book. And again, those clues, we go into those as well. So after that exercise, kids can then apply what they're learning to other news pieces as well, news bulletins of the day. We also go into making news and how to write how to find your own story, what makes a good story, how to structure story writing. So we're talking a lot about critically assessing particular scenarios, or maybe a news report that they can critically assess it and decide how they might cover that story. And yeah, basically that's what it's all about. It's a heady mix of humor, but also of information too, all of which is grounded in practical hands-on learning, which I think is absolutely essential. So that's basically a roundup of breaking news. And if you want to know more about it, of course, you can pick it up in your local bookshop. And that is pretty much, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand back over now to Kezia.
Lovely plug at the end there, Nick.
I know, got to get it in there.
It's available in all good bookshops and online retailers. I'll do that bit for you. But thank you for that overview. We've got a good 45 minutes now really to get into the meat of what the book covers. And I really appreciate the overview there of saying this is not just a book for kids. This is a book for people that work with young people. And actually, there's some real life lessons for us all in terms of how to digest our news and be a bit more questioning of it and look at the sources of it, not least because of the circumstances that we're living in just now. So what I was hoping to do was just talk to you a little bit more about the book itself. Then I wanted to speak to you about the link between democracy and journalism, just explore some of the trends that we're seeing at the moment around that. And then finally, I think we should really talk about Ukraine and the proliferation of fake news and how we can kind of handle that in the current environment that we're all living through. A reminder to our audience that are tuning in, you can ask questions of Nick at any time you like throughout the next 45 minutes just by typing them out in the Q&A box at the foot of your screen, and that will come through to the team here. I do have a long list of questions in front of me though, so don't feel any great pressure to do that, but anything that you do type, I'll do my very best to put to Nick shortly. So Nick, the first thing I was really interested to know, having read this book, is if there was one particular bit of fake news that really annoyed you to such an extent you thought this book had to be written. What's the standout bit of fake news that you've perhaps seen in the past that really caught your attention?
So usually, I think if you work as a journalist, you might kind of pride yourself maybe as being sort of an expert at spotting stuff that is incorrect, or that it is that is fake, or that is designed in some way to trick you or to fool you. I fell victim to quite embarrassing, and it's happened quite a few times in my own professional work, where you might say have a WhatsApp group where people would post in stories and breaking news or breaking developments. And there was a couple of times where in particular I totally outed myself as not even having read the particular article or having drilled down and double sourced the information that I was reading. So it was a couple of times, particularly at the start of the coronavirus pandemic, so in late February, March 2 years ago, where all of a sudden I found this was happening more and more to me. And I was thinking, well, if I'm supposed to be some sort of an expert about this, or if I'm sending people, being utterly mortified to send a link to a friend or a pal or a colleague, and then realize that, oh, actually, no, that's totally fake. Do I delete it? Do I follow it up and try and clarify it? Do I do all this kind of stuff? And the thing, they were so sophisticated was the way it was doing it. And again, it wasn't a case of I would read an article and then think, oh, I'm going to forward this on to somebody. Instead, there were things like videos and things like clips of audio and pictures as well, just simple images that not necessarily had been doctored or had been fake in any way, but just as simple things that this was actually taken 10 years ago in Libya, as opposed to what was taken 5 years ago in Syria. And it didn't feel to me like, certainly I felt like I didn't have the skills and the media literacy myself to evaluate those things. And I thought, well, if I'm not, then how on earth, what chance does any other adult in the outside world, and how would a child know whether what they're sharing is fake or not? And obviously there's a difference between satire, and satire and parody and kind of those sort of fake kind of news stuff like Clickhole and The Onion and stuff like that, or Waterford Whispers in Ireland is a very popular one. But at the same time, I still scroll through my Twitter feed, through my social media feed an awful lot, and although these things may be made as satire and may be a parody, I don't want to pour fun on anyone's, comedy or anything like that, but a lot of the people that I follow will post stuff that is just not true. And yes, they do get a retweet and a laugh and a like and plenty of likes, might go viral, etc. But it was stuck in my head, just some very intelligent people might well think that is real. And that was the real thing that sort of stuck in my craw. And I felt that to try and be a part of the solution, I thought would be a pretty noble pursuit. So it was kind of leading up to around the start of the COVID pandemic in particular, was when I noticed that in myself and thought I would try and make some sort of a positive move to address that.
So you're quite clear that fake news as an issue is on the increase, it's on the rise. I wonder if you think it's particularly concentrated in any one arena, or if there's one place where young people are particularly exposed. I mean, we both know that it's probably our generation, right, that use Facebook, and not people that are vastly younger than us now, but I'm thinking about new social media outlets like TikTok or wherever else. Is there a danger that that's where fake news is happening and we don't see it because it's not a traditional form of media? Where are the danger zones in this debate?
I think the danger zones are, in particular, the danger zone exists wherever the media comes from, and it doesn't matter what platform you're using to get your content. From perhaps myself and yourself, when we were growing up, I think there was a study of something like 70 or 80% of people's news was coming from Facebook, from links and from articles, where people were just reading headlines that was on their timeline, and then they thought that was real and they didn't even click through to the article. That was fine, that was whatever. Young people in particular, I think, younger than me, so maybe 5 or 10 years younger than me, I think actually podcasts is something that is becoming more and more of an issue, particularly those which are based around news and current affairs and discussions, etc. But for people who are much, much younger than that, you would have to, I mean, TikTok is the obvious one. Obviously, if you're watching dance videos, or you're watching the equivalent of what was Vine back in the day when Twitter had Vine, the videos, Jimmy, that's all quite kind of lighthearted stuff. But in particular, I mean, with COVID, you will have seen a lot of TikToks, particularly, and podcasts and audio too, where it's worrying certainly that it's growing, but also because we are existing, and we hear about it all the time, about this echo chamber, and how, us following, we follow accounts that we like, and we retweet things that we like, and we have curated for ourselves on social media basically a gallery of people whose views we agree with. So that in itself presents a challenge for impartiality and for having a clear, unbiased view of the news landscape. So that is true of every age bracket, and young people won't be unique in that environment either. But I suppose we have to remember that whatever platform someone is using, and they hear a piece of info, they could be streaming a video, streaming on Twitch. They could be playing a video game with their pals, and then someone says something, oh, I read that somewhere, and then all of a sudden this echo chamber all begins all over again. So I think we obsess a lot about particularly the platforms that the fake news is coming from, but ultimately I think we have to recognize that no matter what the platform, fake news and sentiments around fake news are going to be very prevalent, whatever that is. So to try and police those platforms, or to say that this particular platform is a real problem, or this particular person on a particular platform is a real issue, better, I think, to equip young people with the skills to evaluate what is real and what is not, and then to teach them to fish, essentially, within the landscape that we're in at the moment.
Just had a question from Caitlin Ryan, who accepts everything that you're saying about the established dangers of fake news and the sophisticated ways in which it's proliferated. But she's wondering if there are any emerging dangers or any new ways that fake news is being developed or spread. You mentioned through computer games there. I mean, that's a new one to me, but are there other things that might be the trends of the future, avenues that fake news can spread that Luddites like me need to be aware of now?
Oh, well, and Luddites like me as well. I was at home in Ireland last weekend, and a friend of mine is a content creator and a kind of a bit of a technical whiz, and he was showing me on his, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with these deep fake videos. So essentially fake videos of, you know, famous people like Tom Cruise or whoever, and somebody has manipulated their mouth essentially to say whatever you want them to say. And I thought this was quite a sort of a rare phenomenon. It was quite a sophisticated piece of technology. But my pal at home had an app on his phone that he could make Vladimir Zelensky had him up on his phone saying that he liked pints, and Vladimir Putin saying something else, and the Pope saying something else. This was just on his phone on an app. So I was totally taken by surprise with that. And again, when I mentioned about parody and satire, that was obviously something, you know, that was a bit of a laugh or a bit of a joke. But I'm, you know, maybe just the journalist in me was thinking about, well, that is a real challenge that we have not even begun to consider within the media landscape. And it's difficult as well for, say, you know, for larger, more established media organizations who are relied upon for trust. So the audience has a high trust level in that organization. Trying to balance that then with the demand and the constant demand that the audience has for content and for the latest lines, the latest pictures and videos. You're trying to get it out, get out as much content as quickly as you can, but then you're trying to balance that with, well, I have to make sure that this is all correct, or I seriously run the risk of hurting the public's trust in the organization that I'm working for. And the old kind of saying within journalism is you can be first with the news and wrong, better to be second with the news and right. But it's the audience necessarily might not understand that, and the disconnect between those two. So I think we have to temper our demand for content and constant rolling updates with, there is a real need for this to be actual true information in the first place. But deep fake videos in particular are one thing that I think we haven't even begun to get our heads around yet. And hopefully, I don't know whether I'll be around for that discussion but yeah, it feels like one that's coming very, very soon.
I'm going to take you back to the issue of trust and maybe the regulation of media in a little bit, because I think there's quite a bit to explore around what we can do about things like deep fakes, especially given that the internet's regulated in a completely different way to traditional broadcasting is. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk a bit more about the book. And one of the things that I really loved about it, Nick, was your focus on news hounds. So kind of the Newshound Hall of Fame in particular, and you highlight throughout the book some of your favourite journalists, and you detail why they're amongst your favourite for particular things that they've achieved. I wondered if you had a standout Newshound Hall of Fame guest that you would want to point to that's in your book. Who stands out most for you?
Well, I have to say, well, I think that there's 4 in the book altogether. There's Mary Colvin, there's Ida B. Wells, there's Louis Theroux, but in the last couple of weeks in particular, Lise Doucette is someone who has just, it's seen, there we go. There she
Mine
is.
too. Yeah, we didn't plan that, Nick, did we? That's complete.
No, there you go. Serendipity. Yeah, and a nice wee
Tell us about Lise Doucette.
well. She's fantastic. I mean, I do feel bad sometimes because, you know, we had maybe 4 Newshound Hall of Famers, and I wanted some of them to be maybe from, you know, from previous times as well, not maybe currently in the sphere. But Lise Doucette, Orla Gearan as well, the reporting that she's doing, Fergal Keane as well. I promise they're not just all Irish, but Fergal Keane or Orla Gearan. Quentin Somerville is someone as well who's just making incredible stuff. And in particular, as well as them, and I do wish maybe within the book, maybe if there's a sequel to the book, I might be able to include the camera people, the technical crews, the producers, the researchers, the translators who also operate in those spaces. And I know that Orla Gearan and Lisa Doucette are always speaking about their teams and how important it is to be surrounded by great teams. But I've been very lucky to work with some fantastic camera people. And I wish that maybe we'd shine a bit more of a spotlight on the camera men and women who have, and the technical crews and the edit staff who just are knocking it out of the park there. But Lise Doucette in particular, I was very lucky to actually book her for an interview. Just when I was starting out being a journalist, and she couldn't have been more pleasant. I wasn't doing the interviewing; I was literally just booking her to do the interview. And she was I think she was in Syria at the time, and she was just the most lovely, welcoming, warm, friendly person ever. So I think, yeah, maybe like yourself, Kezia, maybe I think you were leaning towards Lise Doucette as well.
That's the one that I highlighted. And actually, like, throughout the book, you do talk about the role of the cameramen and the producers and the editors and the construction of a story. And I think it's really nice for young people to be able to see that it's more than just the person fronting out a story that goes into telling the whole thing in the round. But I just wanted to read out the last paragraph that you have about Lise Doucette here, and then go to one of the questions we've had from the audience, because I thought this was particularly nice. You say that she always relays these stories in easy to understand language, and her reports make you feel like you've been pulled through the television screen and are seeing these events with your own eyes and hearing the interview with your own ears. She's presented documentaries on extraordinary girls and women and has won dozens of awards for her reporting. Keep an eye out for her the next time you're watching the news. She rocks. I thought that was particularly nice. We've had a question, Nick, which kind of links to that use of emotion in storytelling. And Luke says, you mentioned in the book that you're trying to bring attention to the use of emotion by fake news creators and getting the kids to look at the sources. Were there any characteristics of fake news that you wanted the kids to recognise in the book? And if so, why did you choose those characteristics? So a kind of emotional take there, Nick. What emotions are people looking for in this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think in particular, I think we can define fake news in lots and lots of different ways, and maybe, you know, motivations behind fake news and why it exists in the world, and what role its creators ultimately think it will play, whatever it's political reasons or social reasons or whatever. But I think if we really drill down to the primary characteristic of fake news, we are, I think, speaking about eliciting a response from the person who's you know, reading it or whatever, and eliciting that response and then them sharing it. So obviously sharing is a massive part of how content moves on the internet. And it's not, a like is all very well, but what the person would much rather you do is to copy the link and share it into another platform, or to send it on to someone else, or to retweet it if it's on Facebook, or to repost it to your Instagram story. And ultimately the reason that they want to do that is, if you think about the agenda that person has. Now, agenda is a very loaded word and very loaded term. It's not necessarily a bad thing. If your agenda is to make somebody laugh, or to, you know, think differently about a particular topic, and that's all very well and good. But I think we have to be upfront and say, well, there is also, I mean, the agenda, there are agendas out there against, that would, within the political sphere, also around even identity politics these days as well, in the conversations that we're having around identity politics. Those are very shareable topics, and particularly kind of first person sort of accounts of their life are very, very shareable, and they do very, very well online. They get shared a lot. But the danger there, I think, is that if the agenda is to put forward a viewpoint that we would generally accept is not okay in our current society, whether to treat a certain sector of society differently because of how they look, who they fall in love with, where they're from, how they identify, those are I think as a society, we have generally accepted that it's not okay to try and elicit or to incite hatred or dislike around a certain group of people and nationality or whatever else. And we've seen an awful lot of that, particularly in the last couple of years. I'm thinking of the situation in America in particularly, and how certain politicians, I think, certainly gained and grew their platform off the back of pointing at other sectors of society and saying the reason that we have a particular problem or a particular issue is because of this group of people. And we have to be very, very wary. And it's about, I think for kids as well, is to make sure that they understand that when you're taking in a bit of content, the person wants you to feel a certain way about a particular topic. And that's totally fine. But if that emoji would be sadness, or would be anger, or would be hatred, or, you know, those are things that we really, really need to be very, very careful about. And even just making them aware that that is happening is such a huge challenge. Never mind actually getting them then to evaluate whether something is real or not, but even just recognizing that response within their own bodies, within their own heads, is really, really what the book is about. It's a good question, though, for sure.
Let's get into the meat of the link between trust, news, and the functioning of democracy itself. I was really struck by a definition you offer at the start of the book about what journalism is. Can you share it with us? What's the definition of journalism in your book?
Yeah, so I guess it's something that we're talking about news, I guess. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
It's basically, there's a big long definition from the dictionary, and it's about the dissimulation, the gathering, collation, assimilation, evaluation of blah blah. I'm definitely going to get.
Want me to read it out? I'm going to read it out.
Go on.
The investigation. So the investigation, collation, and publication of new events and data to the general public, with the aim of disseminating information for the advancement of a democratic, transparent, and informed society. I thought that was quite profound and neatly ties together all of the things that we've talked about so far this afternoon about why this matters. Especially when it comes to healthy functioning democracy. And with some very specific questions about that for you. But I just wonder if you'd give us a short overview of what we know or understand about the degree to which people trust the news, where people get most of their news from, and how and why that might be changing.
So I think personally, it's probably changed a lot in the last 2 years. And that was really the sort of reason that I started to write this book in the first place, because we worked for many, many years as a journalist in radio and in television and online and everywhere else in Ireland and in Scotland as well. And you did always wonder sometimes who is watching, who is the audience, and you're meant to target everything towards your target audience. Picture the person in your head who's looking at this piece of television news or who's listening to this report. And I would often have trouble thinking about who that person was. And it was difficult sometimes to, particularly in television and radio, you feel like sometimes maybe you're just putting this out into the void, into the ether, and you're not necessarily sure what the society that you're putting that news out into looks like. And perhaps on social media and on online news, it's easier because engagement and interaction is a lot easier. When you work in broadcast news in particular, it can be a little bit more difficult. But suddenly, with the coronavirus pandemic, it became clear that everybody was watching the news. Everybody was listening to radio bulletins and was reading news reports. And it was this I suppose, what would the word, this galvanization of a society where suddenly nobody was wondering about, well, actually, we do well with this target audience, this particular demographic, and 15 to 34-year-olds were not doing so well, 8 to 12, Instead, it was, people are tuned into this, people are turning on their televisions to know what impact current day events are going to have on their lives. So our audience was everyone. And it was actually a real, the news story itself was awful, and people were losing their lives and becoming very ill and very sick. We had these awful restrictions placed upon our lives. But as a journalist, it felt, certainly my generation, I think, of journalists had never had a situation like that where all of a sudden we had become a really integral part of the democracy that we were all living in. All of a sudden, the democracy, the society, the community had come together, and we were playing a really integral part of that. And that, I think, has continued in the last 2 years, as restrictions have lifted, have then come back into force again, and then have gradually been lifted again. I think it's going to be really, really interesting talking about where that's going, and I suppose what our role will be going forward. I think it'll be really, really interesting to see whether that sticks or not, and that trust which the majority of people did have in their news outlets. And obviously you have people who still think that the coronavirus was a hoax or whatever else, was some nefarious plot by God knows what. But for the majority of people, I think the trust that they had within their journalists has never been clearer to me. And I think it's going to be really, really interesting going forward. And I'm sure you'll be looking at this as well in the John Smith Centre, just about how that trust in politicians and trust in the media, how that evolves and develops, and whether we go backwards or whether in fact that sticks. I would love it to stick, because that's the whole reason you be a journalist in the first place, is to be trying and reflect the society that people are living in back on them. So yeah, that'll be interesting.
So that example of COVID really resonates with me, because I was like 100% that person who would listen to GMS in the morning during the midst of the pandemic. I would tune into Lunchtime Live to find out what the latest news from the Parliament was, and then again I'd be tuning in the 6 o'clock news. That's very much a sort of rolling 24/7 cycle of news. And I wonder what happens to fact checking in that process, because there's just this constant appetite for more and more and more information. And if everything is so instant, does that make it harder to tell longer and more complicated stories? Like, are we getting the depth that we used to when the news cycle is so 24/7 like that?
Well, that's interesting. On the depth thing, in particular, during the depths of the restrictions, when pretty much society had pretty much shut down, there was a couple of months where we were providing the same amount of content, same amount of material, or we were expected to. In fact, we were maybe, what we wanted to bring out even more content than we usually would. But we found that in particular, maybe 2 or 3 months of the first hard lockdown, we found that we were telling the same stories over and over again. And it was an interesting discussion that we were having in the newsroom around, well, does that negate one story over another? We've told this story. So this bar owner has had to close down his bar. He's had to sack all his staff. He doesn't know whether he'll ever open his bar again. And we would tell that story. My work as consumer affairs correspondent, we would tell it over and over and over again. And actually that gave us an opportunity to hunt for stories that were more, I guess, unusual, I guess. Maybe we were hearing from parts of society that we wouldn't usually hear from. And if it had been a once-off event, then the news coverage would have been saturated, a brief, intense sort of moment of, okay, we'll hear from industry, we'll hear from politics, we'll hear from schools. And that would have been how we covered it. But because it was this protracted, long drawn out thing, all of a sudden we were forced to go to places where we probably wouldn't have gone, or to talk to people that maybe wouldn't always get on the television. And there was this hunger constantly to try and fill running orders and to find different guests. So actually, I think that was a really good, my washing machine, that was a really good exercise for us journalists to be challenged, I suppose, to try and find voices that we wouldn't usually find. So I think it was quite a good exercise in democracy and democratizing journalism, was this long protracted period where we had to work hard to find different voices, which I think we should actually be doing all the time anyway. And I would hope that wouldn't slip as we come out of the pandemic.
You mentioned there, this notion in some quarters that COVID was somehow a hoax, and how that was kind of easily dismissed with the facts and the reality of it. You didn't have to address that in reporting. But I am intrigued by how you handle things like political balance in practice. And in particular, how do you determine what's a political issue versus a political reality? I'm thinking of issues like climate change, which, over the past 20 years, we've gone from saying, well, there's a debate to be had about whether it exists, to the science saying, well, it very clearly exists and you don't have to platform deniers in the way that you used to. How does that political balance work in practice? And you can address that. And then I've got a very specific question from somebody called Fiona Stalker that I want to put to you in a second.
Oh dear, she sounds like a bit of a ruffian. The political thing is always kind of more difficult, I think, particularly, well, the example will be one that Fiona would know actually quite well, which is 7 Days, which is it's a discussion program which goes out on Sunday nights on BBC Scotland. And what we what we've tried to do is we've tried to bring always a range of views, of course. And you mentioned climate change there and impartiality. And a big part of, say, the climate change debate would have been, well, we have to give something due impartiality. So that it means that to be impartial, you don't have to give 30 minutes of someone who thinks climate change is real, 30 minutes to someone who doesn't. You have to weigh up the issues and decide which deserves more airtime. But when it's a real challenge for us on 7 days because we want to have a balanced discussion. But also I'm thinking of Partygate and Boris Johnson and Downing Street and all that kind of stuff. It was very difficult for us to try and have a balanced, impartial discussion on that when even people within the Conservative Party, say in Scotland, were finding issues with how things were being done. So you sometimes find yourself in a position as a presenter, as a journalist, where you do have to posit this contrary view, which is absolutely correct. But sometimes it can be difficult, I think, to actually find what that position might ultimately be. Because you can bet that even if your panel are all in agreement on one issue, the audience certainly are not all in agreement on one particular issue. And if, because we live in a particular bubble, and we, as I said, we live in an echo chamber that we've created all of our own. But we have to be mindful always that the audience is not on the same page as we are. So when it comes to politics, trying to find that balance is a constant struggle. I probably get it wrong so many times. I'm sure everybody gets it wrong lots of times. But to try and strive as much as you can for balance and to reflect the landscape of the democracy out the window is I think is the constant aim, the constant mission, I think.
So Fiona Stalker describes herself as your TV wife, and she's tuned in today to check what you're up to. And she's put a plea out to ask you whether you might mention the role or the work of Mariana Spring, the BBC's senior disinformation journalist. Fiona highlights that she does incredible work on COVID, climate change, and Ukraine conspiracy theories. And she wonders, Nick, whether you think this type of journalism will become more core to public service news outlets.
I think it'll have to be, and Mariana does the most amazing work, and she's only one woman, but she must be the busiest woman in the BBC at the moment, and she's done loads. She worked on podcasts and written news reports, and Fiona, I know, has interviewed her as well many times. But Mariana's specialist subject is disinformation, and in particular, I suppose these hot button issues. So of course, with COVID vaccines, for example, as you mentioned, of course, with Ukraine and Russia and all of that as well, Mariana is going to be super busy. But I think there needs to be, in every newsroom in the country, there needs to be some sort of unit that is just looking at disinformation in particular and trying to kind of squash some of these theories or some of the ideas that somehow become the prevailing view, despite the fact that they're not actually true. So in the book, at the end of the book, we have a list of resources and of places like I'm thinking of Reality Check on the BBC, Chris Morrison and his team, and Mariana, obviously the work that she does. There's a great, in Ireland, we have the journal.ie has a fantastic fact-checking service. I know Channel 4 has been working a lot to try and work against disinformation, but I would imagine that this is a sector that is only going to grow and grow and grow. I think Mariana is going to be one of many, the first of many disinformation reporters. She does fantastic work and gets an awful lot of abuse for it as well online. That is, it's a whole other thing. But the abuse that she gets is, I think, particularly as a woman, I think as well, that's often used as some sort of a stick to beat Mariana with, and it's shocking some of the stuff that she's got. But she seems to have a very thick skin, and she keeps doing her work to a very, very, very high standard. So big fan of Mariana. She would go in a Newshound Hall of Fame, I think, any day of the week. Along
She's going in addition to, yes, we've got 2 nominations here for the second edition of the book. And that abuse is, of course, utterly unacceptable in any circumstance. But there is something about the fact that she's getting that abuse, which highlights perhaps how critical her work is and how much impact it is having. We've had another question here about the role of confirmation bias and whether that contributes to the danger of fake news. So Gavin's asking, are people less likely to question news if they agree with the point of view, whether it's true or not?
Well, I think yes is the answer to that. Without question, people are, and I kind of alluded to this maybe earlier on, and I think the first way of dealing with confirmation bias is to acknowledge that we all have it, and it impacts every aspect of our lives, and certainly will impact if you're a journalist, then certainly you have to try and fight against it as much as you can. There are some really, particularly at least in the BBC newsroom at the moment, some of the most important voices are the voices that are posing alternative viewpoints constantly. Jen Stout is a journalist who's now based on the Romanian border with Ukraine, reporting from there, an amazing journalist originally from Shetland. And Jen was someone very quietly spoken, but in every meeting that we would have around bulletins and editorial issues and how we would cover it, Jen was always someone who was posing alternative views, not necessarily being the devil's advocate or a contrarian view. It wasn't that at all. It was simply her teasing out what were the decision making that was going on in our own heads when we said, oh well, of course such and such, of course A, B, C, and D. And Jen was somebody who would actually just sort of pause and would make us think, well, actually, is that actually the case? Or is that true? And there are multiple more examples in many of the newsrooms that I work with. Some of these people in meetings can end up being kind of unpopular in a meeting because people feel like their views are being personally attacked. But in actual fact, what the person is doing is playing the role of a journalist, of an unbiased, impartial, clear-viewed person who can try and work against their confirmation bias a lot more. It's much more difficult to do that on social media or online, particularly when Twitter is basically confirmationbias.com, because you're just following everybody that you agree with, everyone agrees, and then we all just sort of agree with each other and that sort of it. And then now and again somebody maybe disagrees, and then we all decide we hate that person and we cancel them and they get quote tweeted and whatever else. So that's kind of the pattern I think that it follows, but confirmation bias is massive, yes, for sure.
Is that an argument for public broadcasting, for state-funded public broadcasting that's got independent journalism at its heart?
Well, I would of course say that, because that's who I work for. But I mean, I've worked in commercial commercial stations journalism, and I've also worked in public service broadcasting. And I have to say that I always laugh. There's particularly at home in Ireland, there's often there are specific business people who might have large shareholdings or ownership over particular media companies, and the journalists who work for those companies are constantly being accused of bias and of prejudicial reporting. And I have to say, I have never ever come across a journalist who says, "Oh no, we can't do that story because of A, B, C, or D." So I really, and an awful lot of the commercial radio stations are local stations as well, and the role that local journalism plays is really, really important. So I really think, of course, public broadcasting is very important, but I think sometimes we can forget the importance of the smaller commercial broadcasters who are nimbler, who perhaps in a local setting are much more in touch with local communities and local groups and the concerns of maybe, might not make breaking news headlines, but are just as important to the democratic process, I feel. So certainly, I think in that sense, there is an argument for public service broadcasting, most certainly, but definitely the smaller commercial radio stations, I think, and TV stations, if you're lucky enough to have one, are super, super important as well.
So this theme is stimulating lots of questions from our audience. So I'm going to see if we can get through lots of these on this theme, starting with Jeffrey, who asks, how do you ensure journalistic independence, whether from proprietors or from government? For example, the threats to the BBC for being insufficiently pro-government. Yeah,
so as I sort of mentioned there, having worked in places that are privately owned and places that are publicly funded, you will always have accusations from every side about how, oh, you are reporting this because of a particular issue, or you're not reporting this because of who owns the company that you're working for. Again, it has never happened. The idea that I think often kind of newsrooms are even organized enough to have some sort of great conspiracy going on in them is, I sometimes find a bit funny, because a lot of the newsrooms that I've worked in are so chaotic that there is no agenda whatsoever. There's hardly a news agenda, let alone any other sort of agenda. But certainly that sort of criticism is a good, I mean, as long as it's phrased in a way that is, I suppose, that is respectful, and that everybody is airing their views in a way that isn't trying to upset anybody or insult anybody. I think that sort of criticism is really, really quite vital, certainly for the democratic functioning of a role that a broadcaster plays within a society. And I think anybody who thought that those sort of critical voices should be silenced in any way, I think actually plays right back into the idea that that is not a functioning democracy. That is something, of course, the free press has to operate within a functioning democracy, but equally the press is not immune to criticism and should never be immune to criticism, no more than any proprietor or businessman or government or political party should be as well, without fear or favour, of course, that we should continue to criticise and look inwardly on ourselves as much as we can as a media, I think.
Linked to that, Dane asks, do you think it is important that young people know about editorial biases in media organisations and in media individuals? And what would you say to a young person about how they can find these out if they aren't obvious to the eye?
That's a good question. I think yes, and I think ultimately that plays back into not just evaluating the sources, but also evaluating the outlets which the sources are coming from. So particularly, I guess, within, say, the United States, those sort of media outlets are much more, I suppose, open about what particular stance they're coming from on particular issues. If we look at RT in the last couple of weeks, RT is an outlet that has itself been the subject of censure. So I think, yes, we potentially, that's a little bit further down the line, say, for children at least. If I can, within this book, if I can make kids know that the information that you're getting is always coming from a particular viewpoint, and it is always coming from a particular viewpoint, and evaluating that source and indeed evaluating that outlet then as well that it's coming from, I think that is an absolutely critical thing for media literacy for kids. No more than you would, for say, if there was a general election coming up, and a political party put through a pamphlet or a leaflet through your letterbox and said that this party is bad because they want to do A, B, C, and D, then of course it's important to look at the claim and to see whether we think it's true or not. But a way of evaluating that source is also to look at the political party who's put it out and to then evaluate, well, that outlet, what position are they coming from? What standing point are they coming from? So yeah, I think that's a massive thing for sure.
I'm struck by the example you gave of America there, and then also say something about RT, and that'll lead us to talking about the Ukraine. But I'm just thinking in my head of that young person that's maybe living in America in a household where Fox News is the only thing that's ever on the TV. And if that's the only thing you're ever exposed to, how can you begin to understand that there is another view of the world if that's the only thing that you actually see day after day?
I think that's a really, really good question, and I think that particularly in America at the moment, in the United States. Now, I'm no expert on the landscape over there, but it certainly seems, much as a lot of what has happened in the UK as well, there's a real fierce polarization of society and polarization of views, and a lot of extremes are coming into the debate. If you are that younger person who, as you say, the only say information or outlet that you see is an outlet that is skewed heavily to the right, or indeed skewed heavily to the left, that is, it's, of course, it is a lot easier now, of course, with the internet being there, that can have its pros and its cons, and that it may lead you to be even more exposed and more heavily entrenched in that kind of ideology, or in fact, it could provide something of an out for you, that whereby you can learn more about the world through other outlets and other media organisations. It's something I think that here in the UK and in Ireland, I guess in general, whereby there are some outlets that have clear political leanings. In fairness, there are many outlets who hold that as a badge of honour that they don't, and that has been what has been such a pleasure to work for the BBC, and continues to be a pleasure to work for the BBC, is its, you know, its commitment to impartiality and to truth and to fairness, is something. So that is why I think working in the United States has never really had any attraction for me at all, because I really feel very, very uncomfortable with the idea of trying to work as a journalist while at the same time trying to coming at the news, or trying to filtering facts through a certain lens, which to me is a kind of a dangerous phrase, and I don't think it's healthy for a functioning democracy, I wouldn't think.
You pointed to a really important principle there, this key question of impartiality. But there's another value at stake here, isn't there? When we talk about outlets like Russia Today, some people will argue that that's a question of free speech. And you've even actually got, you know, front bench conservative government ministers right now saying you shouldn't take channels like RT off the air, because in a free and functioning democratic society, there is a role for that free speech. Do you think RT should be banned? Is that an issue for Ofcom? Do you have a particular strong viewpoint on that? Do we have enough rigor in the system to make these judgments at times like this?
I think, ultimately, yeah. I mean, it's a matter for Ofcom. RT has fallen foul of Ofcom before, as have many media organisations. It's a really interesting question around freedom of speech and how important freedom of speech is for a functioning democracy. On the other hand, I think of democracy in Ukraine at the moment and what that looks like, and indeed democracy in Russia, and how, in fact, the media in Russia doesn't suggest to me that there's a particularly healthy functioning democracy at work in Russia at the moment. Certainly as a journalist, it's very, very difficult to say that a particular outlet should be taken off the air entirely. But then you have to remember that as well, RT operates mainly outside of Russia. And being an English-speaking channel, that in fact a lot of the information that they are putting out into the world is for the benefit of non-Russians, and is trying to paint a particular picture of Russia to outsiders. So that is something that is something that I don't have a clear-cut answer. That's something that I am struggling with quite a lot. RT is certainly not something that I would turn on to get my facts from. But then neither will I turn on Fox News. I don't think Fox News should be taken off the air. But it's a particularly hot, emotive topic at the moment now, of course, because we know that we're witness to the atrocities that the Kremlin are perpetrating, and we know that RT is financed by money from the Kremlin. So it's a really difficult one to answer. I don't think I have a clear, straight answer, but certainly it's certainly Ofcom should of course be involved, I think.
So we've got less than 3 minutes left and 3 questions to go, and then I've still got to take 30 seconds to remind people about the next John Smith Centre event. So we're going for super short answers, if we possibly can. So Thomas, who I think might be a burning journalist student, would like some advice. He says, you mentioned some of the people who you've interviewed as a journalist. Do you have any tips for interviewing someone who seems closed off and might just give short answers?
Oh, that is really tough. That's one of the hardest things to do, definitely. I think what you need to do is certainly to speak to them on the phone. I lecture journalism students during the week, and so many of them are really afraid of picking up the phone and talking to people, and instead they email them all the time. I would just set up a time for a phone call where you can lay out, and you have to be very upfront and clear and honest about what you're hoping to talk about, and just have a chat to them about what their experience is. I'm not entirely sure what the interview is in that case, but certainly just to speak to them before you actually ring them and ask for an interview. Just ring them up, say let's have a phone call. Maybe we can meet for a coffee if you want. I lay out exactly what all this is, what the interview is going to be about. I can provide within reason a list of kind of broad topics that we're going to cover if you want to do any research. And just pre-record it and just take all the time you need as much as possible. But that is a hard.
But human connection goes a long way. Now, I know the answer to this question because I've read the book, and this is just another plug that you can buy Breaking News, how to find out what's real from what's rubbish. But Catherine asks whether fake news is a new phenomenon or not. Absolutely not, Catherine. And we go in the book, we go all the way back to I think it's the ancient Greeks and then ancient
within the Chinese dynasties, and then we talk about the invention of the cavemen and everything. Yeah. And we go all the way back and we trace through fake news from the start of time right up to the current day. So no, it's certainly not a new phenomenon at all. No.
And a final question from Trish is, do you have any podcasts you'd recommend?
Podcasts. Well, I do love listening to podcasts. In terms of maybe like news and current affairs podcasts,
yeah.
I love like newscast. I'm a big fan of that on the BBC. They're doing a Ukraine cast at the moment as well, which is excellent. So I'm a big fan of those. What else? Podlitical on BBC Scotland. I always think is a good listen. It's a bit of a laugh a lot of the time. What else? And if you're just looking for something a little bit stupid to listen to, Uncanny on the BBC, ghost stories. If you ever, because it's very important, as we mentioned in the book, to turn off and not to just keep battering yourself over the head with news the whole time. Listen to a ghost story or give yourself a fright, something like that.
We're very shortly going to have to turn off this session. Nick, it's been absolutely fantastic to spend an hour in your company and to hear a little bit more about this fantastic book, Breaking News, which we'd encourage everybody tuning in.
Thank you for having me, Kezia. Pleasure.
To have a good read of. And also just a final thank you to everyone who's watching. If you're doing so live, please take a moment to complete the evaluation form, which you're about to see on your screen and find in your inbox. It really helps us shape future events. We'll be back in a few weeks' time with a panel debate on the local government elections with representatives from the Electoral Reform Society, from Women 50/50, the Scottish National Party and the Conservatives. If you'd like to be the first to know about our events, please take a moment to sign up for our newsletter. Until then, bye for now.